I'm sitting here with Annalee Newitz, who is the editor of IO9, a wonderful website beloved by science fans and science fiction fans. Annalee, hello.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah, I got to tell you that one thing I wanted to tell you so much. It's anytime I go to your site, it's risky because I know I will be opening many tabs because you have a great sidebar. So any story I go to, whether it's a science story or sci-fi story, in the sidebar, it's just full of wonders. There's so much to choose from that it's like, okay, I gotta, open another tab for that one and that one and that, and just like
That's our goal, is basically to keep you addicted, keep you from working. We don't want you actually ever being a productive person. We just want you clicking on things and absorbing new information, and that's...
You have succeeded.
Yeah, world domination is probably soon to come, yeah.
And I heard you say something. We're at the ScienceOnline conference where we've been discussing science communication, and I guess some people have thought that you have the science fiction stories, they're the big flashy things that draw the big numbers, and then you're trying to force feed people science. But that doesn't really seem like how it works, does it?
No, and in fact what we found is the science fiction stories that we run, and generally these are stories about science fiction, so we're covering entertainment and comic books and movies. Those stories are very popular, and definitely people enjoy them, but the stories that really get passed around and that get huge numbers of readers are the science stories, because people really want to have a sense that the wonder that they get from science fiction can actually exist in the real world. That's my theory, is that it gets them even more excited. And also, science translates really well. When we talk about our favorite TV shows here, in the United States or in the English-speaking world, say we're talking about Battlestar Galactica, that may not translate well to an audience in Japan or China, but if we're talking about the latest development in biotechnology, that's something that really does translate. You don't have to have that kind of cultural context for it. It's really, it can capture an international imagination. So, and that's what's great about the web, is that you can reach that audience. So,
are there any particular stories? Is there a story that is your most popular story ever?
Well, there have been a number of very, very popular stories. Actually, one of our most popular stories recently was about a young man who has been fighting for education reform in his state, where there are, in Louisiana, where textbooks about evolution are being pulled from schools, and he's leading a campaign to improve science education for high school students. And he started this when he was in high school, and that really caught people's imaginations. People fighting for science to be included in schools. So it's kind of a meta story about why science is important. But then, of course, there's all kinds of other science stories, from stories about the history of how Greek statues were made. That was a really popular story. Stories about, obviously physics experiments are very popular. There's somebody at NASA who's working on the very first germs of warp drive, and of course people are very excited about that. So it really is a broad range of stuff, but it's just people are on fire with science. So
IO9.com. What does IO9 mean?
Okay. So IO9s are brain implants, and people in the 2070s, they were really popular among kind of hipsters. They were implanting them, they were kind of seeing the future, and it was driving them crazy. And so they were outlawed. And so now people who are IO9ers, they're like the early adopters of brain technology, and the ones who are kind of on the cutting edge. So we've named ourselves after this implant. But there's a true story behind it as well, which is...
Can we pull back that? That's a beautiful story, and can we pull that layer back, and what do we find?
So the simple answer is that when we started thinking about doing a futurism and science fiction and science blog, I was working with Gawker Media, and they had some ideas about names, and we've reached a point where you can want to have a name and the domain isn't available, and some of the names we wanted belonged to weird Italian spam lords, and so we were really racking our brains, and I contacted a friend of mine who just had a bunch of domain names, and I said, what do you have that sounds science fictional? And we liked IO9 because it was short, but also it sounds like some weird object from the future. You can project whatever you want onto it. And so that was what we wanted, was something that didn't really remind you of anything. And so you could it's the blank slate of the future.
But
we also made up that story about the brain implant.
okay, but didn't you tell me that you made that up? Totally invented name, but in a way, it self-actualized
It became
itself.
part of science fiction because the writers of the show Dollhouse, Joss Whedon's most recent television show, actually included IO9 as a technology in the show for actually being kind of a brain implant. They have a sort of brain erasure and revision technology. And so now it's been retconned twice. Basically, like, we retconned it originally as a brain implant, and then another show came along and retconned it again. We contacted the writers, and they said, yes, we definitely put that in for you guys. And
How'd that make you feel?
That was like a moment of squee, for sure. Like, yeah, we were like, yay! So, yeah, that was a nice day when that happened.
Well, it's incredible. So the site, yes, it has these science fiction stories, content, but also not science fiction stories, but stories about science fiction, but so much science stuff. Now, so you've become the editor as editor, have built an amazing site that, as I said, no lie, I mean, it's a favorite site of so many people at the ScienceOnline conference. Got pretty giddy when you identify yourself.
It's very nice.
You don't have a science background, do you? I know you've been a writer for a long time.
Well, I started out in academia, and I was doing what's called American Studies, which is an interdisciplinary field that combines some social science and some humanities. And I was actually studying in large part, representations of science in the media. I was looking at the 20th century, because it actually was the 20th century back then, and I sort of have gone from writing about that to actually producing representations of science in the media. So I've kind of come full circle where I've become the thing that I used to study. So I don't know if that's like a Jekyll and Hyde kind of scenario, but yeah, I mean, I've now for about 12 or 13 years been focused entirely on writing about technology and science. So.
Right. Can you just, so you're in San Francisco, and can you tell me a little bit, have you been in San Francisco? I know you've been in San Francisco a long time, but are you originally from San Francisco?
I'm a Californian, so
Okay.
I grew up in Southern California and went up to Berkeley to study and then moved over to San Francisco. So my trajectory's been sort of a little line and a little dash at the top.
I mean, I lived in San Francisco for 17 years, and I remember you used to have a tech column.
Yeah, techsploitation.
Techsploitation, exactly.
Yeah.
So you've been writing tech for years.
Yeah, I was always obsessed with technology, and even when I was in high school, I was doing BBSs and things like that because those were cool. And so then when I left academia, I said, well, I'd really like to actually get in deeper and really look at how do computer networks work, and at that time open source software was like a really new idea for people, and I really wanted to kind of evangelize on its behalf. So I moved from that into covering science, which is kind of a trajectory that I think a lot of people take. Usually the other way, though. It's usually start with science and then they get into technology. But yeah, I think there's a lot of interesting overlap there. So it's been fun.
And one of the questions that really is occurring to me constantly around this crowd. The crowd who was here. I swear. But the people that attend ScienceOnline, you're amazingly prolific, and as a producer, but also as a consumer. And it's like anything that comes up, like we just had this discussion of science and science fiction, and you are unbelievably well read across that, or you've consumed enough of the Buffy universe and
mass media.
Yes, it's like, how can you possibly? Are you writing and watching at the same time?
Sometimes,
yeah.
Oh, absolutely, sometimes for sure. And you kind of have to. But yeah, I mean, I'm doing what I love, which is so lucky. And I would be reading and watching this stuff anyway. So it's just super delightful that I can actually bring it into my actual work. So. I've been a science fiction fan since I was a kid.
Then let me ask you, who are you excited about in science fiction? Like today, maybe recommendations.
So right now on TV, I would recommend the show Person of Interest, which is actually barely science fiction. And I've gotten into a lot of arguments about this, but it has a character which is a nascent artificial intelligence who kind of lurks in the background and pulls a lot of the strings in the show. And it's a show about surveillance technology and what if surveillance technology became sentient. And the human characters are surveillance subversives. And so they exploit the surveillance system to actually solve crimes and help people. It's a very interesting idea because we're moving into a total surveillance society, but there's very few stories about heroes who actually use surveillance as part of what they do to rescue people. So it raises a lot of interesting questions about how our society is changing with all of these cameras everywhere. So that's really fun. I recommend that. I'm also really excited about, gosh, there's so many books coming out now that are just fantastic. You know, a lot of people have talked about Paolo Bacigalupi, who's doing fantastic kind of eco-thrillers, and I'm really excited about that general trend in science fiction toward looking at the environment. And Kim Stanley Robinson's new novel, 2312, is in that vein as well. He's looking at geoengineering.
I don't read as much new as classic stuff, but you know, Charles Yu, who I don't even know. I feel like I tell people that it's like How to Live Safely in a Science Fictional Universe, and I know you've featured him on the site a couple times.
I really loved that novel.
And I describe it as it's really literature for people that love the tropes of science fiction, that you're familiar. It's good that you like science fiction. It is.
I mean, let's face it, it really is. And I think that, you know, we're continuing to see this merging between literature and science fiction more and more. And like people like Margaret Atwood, who write science fiction but insist that they don't, I think are kind of, you know, they're becoming more and more, they're becoming less and less adamant, I think, about that distinction. Like even Margaret Atwood is kind of admitting a little bit that science fiction is cool, and that, you know, it's still a literary form. There's also a lot of really great fantasy writing that's coming out now that kind of employs the tropes of science fiction, like N.K. Jemisin, who just kind of emerged on the scene like a train, you know, with a ton of books that are really interesting. And she's working with a lot of really fascinating issues set on other worlds where there's magic, but there's a lot of the issues that we deal with on Earth, like class distinctions and the way in which our identity is formed by the society that we grow up in. And I'd really recommend her stuff for people who are fans of fantasy or just science fiction that's very speculative. So yeah, I mean, there's just a ton of great stuff that's out now.
Yeah, and I guess I would just ask you, what about in science? And I get the feeling that one of the areas you're really excited about, based on a few things you've said, is synthetic biology. Is that true?
Yeah. No, I am. And actually, I mean, it's been really interesting kind of interviewing synthetic biologists about how it could affect the future of humanity. Because I think for biologists, unless they're people like George Church, who I think has reached a point in his career where he can kind of speculate and not worry that he's going to be kind of misconstrued or lose all of his funding. You know, it's really hard for people to say, actually, I would love for my work to help us build enhanced humans. And I interviewed, or I spoke with Drew Endy at one point, who's one of the people who helped innovate the idea of biobricks, which are little biological parts that you could use to engineer, you know, whatever type of biological mechanism you wanted, hopefully in the future. And he said, you know, and I think he was kind of trying to stir the waters a little bit. He's like, I hate science fiction. It's ruined my profession because every time I talk about what I do, people bring up Frankenstein. And I'm just so tired of that. And I think that, so I think there's that tension where people in the sciences feel like, you know, there's all of these myths about what they're doing and in fact really aren't relevant to where we might go with this technology. But yeah, I think synthetic biology as a concept has a lot of imaginative potential because it's all about creating new kinds of biology, not new life forms necessarily. It could be machines that just incorporate biological components. Like imagine something that was like a synthetic photosynthetic machine. So you could maybe incorporate biological components or just imitate the way that leaves do photosynthesis and actually have a much more efficient solar panel. So there's so many potentials there that, yeah, it kind of makes my imagination light on fire.
I'm sitting here with Annalee. I'm going to try to clear my throat. It's probably doomed.
This is the water drinking portion of our show.